So, for thousands of years, I mean, the story of Cain and Abel has really just been taught as this ultimate cautionary tale.
Right, of jealousy and, you know,
Yeah.
the first murder.
Exactly. It's this foundational narrative that just feels, well, entirely self-contained.
Yeah.
But what if the victim's blood wasn't actually crying out for vengeance from the soil? What if it was asking for something entirely different?
That's the big
It
question.
really is. So welcome to the deep dive. Today we are exploring a framework for reading ancient texts that essentially, turns a simple timeline into a four-dimensional blueprint. We're going to look at how a seemingly straightforward historical account is actually analyzed as a meticulously crafted anticipatory prototype, basically a hidden schematic predicting events thousands of years in the future.
It is a phenomenal way to approach ancient literature. And to unpack this, we're diving into a transcript from a really fascinating theological video essay.
Right, from YouTube.
Yeah, by the YouTube channel Descubriendo la Escritura, which translates to Discovering Scripture.
Okay.
And the speaker in this video lays out an incredibly dense, pattern-based interpretation of the Genesis narrative.
Yeah, they really do.
They argue that much of the Old Testament acts as a shadow, like a literal anticipatory model for future realities, specifically for Christ and the nation of Israel.
And before we get too deep into the mechanics of this, it's probably worth setting up our core mission for you today.
Oh, definitely.
Because our goal with this deep dive is strictly an impartial exploration. We're just looking at how this source material analyzes these ancient texts for hidden patterns.
Right. We aren't here to endorse these specific theological viewpoints.
No, not at all. We aren't taking any religious or political sides. Our job is purely to unpack the fascinating ways these texts are, taken apart and put back together to reveal these hidden architectural designs.
Exactly. We just want to show you the lens through which this interpretation operates.
And that lens is really the key here.
It is. It relies heavily on the concept of prototypes. In this specific framework, a prototype is a person or an event that serves as a rough draft for a much larger ultimate reality later on. The video actually mentions that Christ fulfilled over 300 of these prototypes or prophecies. But it anchors this entire theory on one very specific piece of evidence from the New Testament.
Yeah, and to put this in a modern context for you, think of these prototypes like Easter eggs in a massive movie franchise.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, like they hint at a sequel. When a character in movie one offhandedly mentions a glowing cube, and then
3 movies later, that cube is the center of the entire plot.
Exactly. It's a detail just waiting to be activated.
Yeah.
So what is the specific Easter egg the source points to that kicks off this whole Cain and Abel theory?
Well, the source points directly to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 11.
Okay.
Jesus is speaking to the religious leaders of his day, and he lists the prophets whose blood was shed throughout history.
Right.
And he explicitly establishes a timeline, saying, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah. Yeah. By doing this, the source argues, Jesus firmly categorizes Abel as a prophet. He's establishing a massive timeline of persecution that starts at the very foundation of the world.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. Because if you read the Genesis story, Abel never spoke a single recorded prophecy.
No, he doesn't.
He doesn't give a speech. He doesn't have a burning bush moment.
Right.
He literally just offers a sacrifice and then gets killed. So if Abel never predicted the future out loud, how can he be classified as a prophet?
It's a great question.
I mean, is the argument here that his life itself was the prophecy?
That is exactly the core argument.
Right.
And it really highlights a major difference between modern literalism and ancient textual analysis.
How so?
Well, today, we limit our definition of prophecy to foretelling the future with words. Like we think of Nostradamus.
Right, crystal balls and predictions.
Exactly. But in this prototype framework, prophecy is performative. It is about prefiguring a future figure through action, circumstance, and even suffering. Yet, Abel is a prophet because his life was a physical acting out of a future reality. He was living a prophetic pattern.
So it's like his whole existence was a trailer for a movie that wasn't going to come out for thousands of years.
A trailer that he didn't even know he was starring in.
That is wild.
It is. And once you view ancient literature through that lens, where a life is a deliberate prophetic pattern, you start looking at the text differently.
Except for looking just at the plot.
Right. You start looking at the architecture of the story. And the source argues this architectural design extends deeply into what the text intentionally leaves out.
which brings up the mystery of the missing genealogy.
Yes, the redaction.
Because if you're reading through Genesis, you get to chapter 5, and it gives this little wrap-up of early human history.
Mm-hmm.
It notes that Adam lived 130 years and had a son, quote, in his own likeness, according to his image, and named him Seth.
Right.
But our source points out that this phrasing effectively excludes both Cain and Abel from the primary human genealogy.
Completely ignores them.
Yeah, it's like they've been redacted from the official family tree. And the source argues this omission is a deliberate literary and theological choice to elevate them as symbolic figures.
Yes.
But I do have to push back on this a little bit.
Go for it.
Couldn't it be left out simply because of the plot mechanics? I mean, Abel died very young, without kids, and Cain committed murder and was banished.
True.
It just feels like an official company history skipping over the original founders who left in a scandal just to focus on the current CEO's narrative.
Right. It's practical.
Exactly. Why does their absence have to be a mystical symbol?
Well, what's fascinating here is that it is a logical reading if we treat Genesis like a modern historical textbook.
Mm-hmm.
Or a corporate audit, like your example.
Yeah.
But we have to remember the mechanics of ancient theological writing. In these texts, omissions are heavily engineered.
Engineered how?
Think of it like an artist painting a portrait, but intentionally leaving the entire background blank canvas. They aren't doing it because they ran out of paint. They are stripping away the earthly context to force the viewer to look only at the subject.
Oh, I see.
It elevates them from a normal person in a room to a timeless icon.
So by stepping out of the standard lineage, Cain and Abel they're decoupled from normal human history to become archetypes.
Precisely. And the source brilliantly parallels this redaction in Genesis to the New Testament depiction of Jesus.
How does that connect?
If you look at the Gospel of John, it doesn't start with a human genealogy like Matthew or Luke does.
Oh, right. It starts with, in the beginning was the Word.
Exactly. John portrays Jesus as lacking a standard human origin, placing him outside the normal genealogical flow. The source is saying Genesis did the exact same thing with Cain and Abel. It is signaling to the reader, pay attention, these aren't just historical footnotes. These are cosmic symbols.
So understanding a text deeply means learning to look at the negative space.
Mm-hmm. The things that aren't there are just as loud as the things that are.
And the negative space here really isolates them for the main event.
Yes, it does.
Because their omission sets them apart symbolically. But the actual murder in the field is where the source introduces this radical twist.
It is a massive twist.
It's a complete reinterpretation of a moment literally everyone thinks they know.
It forces you to completely reevaluate the emotional core of the entire narrative.
Yeah. So we have Genesis chapter 4. God confronts Cain and says, "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground."
Right.
Now, for centuries, pop culture, sermons, classic literature, they all interpret this as a cry for vengeance.
Always.
The blood is screaming, "Avenge me! I demand justice."
Yeah, that's the standard reading.
But the source challenges this by connecting that Genesis verse with a very specific verse deep in the New Testament.
They bring in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 24.
Okay.
That passage states that Jesus' sprinkled blood speaks a better word than the blood of Abel.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The source asks the obvious question. What was Abel's blood actually saying?
Right.
If Jesus' blood is saying something better, what was the original message? And the massive twist here is the assertion that Abel's blood was not crying out for vengeance.
Not at all.
It wasn't demanding justice. According to this prototype theory, Abel's blood was crying out for forgiveness for his brother Cain.
It's just a profound paradigm shift.
It's like a victim taking the stand in a courtroom, staring at the person who just destroyed their life, and instead of asking the judge to throw away the key, they beg the judge for clemency. They ask for mercy on their attacker. That is a staggering shift in how we read that scene.
It is, but look at how perfectly this aligns with the prototype framework the source is building.
How so?
If Abel is the ultimate early prototype of Christ, his actions have to mirror Christ's ultimate actions.
Okay.
What did Jesus do on the cross? He famously asked God to forgive his executioners because they didn't know what they were doing.
Wow, right.
So if Abel's blood is the prototype to Jesus' blood, then Abel's blood was essentially praying for Cain from the soil. The blood speaks, and it speaks mercy.
So if that's true, if Abel's blood was actively begging for mercy rather than demanding a cosmic hit out on his brother, That completely changes God's reaction.
Yes.
It flips our entire understanding of the aftermath and what happens next to the murderer.
It rewrites one of the most famous idioms in human history, the mark of Cain.
Yeah, because we use the mark of Cain in our cultural lexicon to mean a curse.
Right.
It's a permanent stain of evil, a scarlet letter that shows everyone you are a monster and an outcast.
Exactly.
But according to the source, the text actually portrays the exact opposite.
Because Abel prayed for mercy, the source argues, God granted it. The mark of Cain was actually a mark of divine forgiveness and protection.
A mark of protection.
Yes, God decreed that anyone who killed Cain would suffer sevenfold vengeance. The mark wasn't a target painted on his back. It was a divine shield. And this is where the source's dual prototype theory really locks into place.
No, dual prototype. We established that Abel is the prototype of Christ. So who is Cain the prototype for in this framework?
The source argues that Cain is the prototype of Israel.
Okay.
The parallel works beautifully when you understand how the source is reading the text typologically.
Explain typologically for us.
Basically, using a person or event as a standing symbol or a type for a larger group later in history.
Got it.
The source lays it out like this. Israel, who the overarching biblical text uses as a symbol for those who rejected and ultimately killed Jesus, was dispersed worldwide, wandering as nomads for centuries.
Right.
Yet, according to this theological framework, they remain divinely protected and indestructible.
Just like Cain.
Exactly.
He kills his brother, he becomes a nomad wandering the earth, but he carries a mark of absolute divine protection.
The parallels of action and consequence are mirrored perfectly, and the source goes even further.
Yeah.
They challenge this massive popular notion that Cain's entire lineage was purely evil.
Oh, right.
There's a common cultural assumption that the Great Flood had to happen because Cain's descendants basically ruined the earth.
Yeah, you hear that a lot.
But the source points out that the text specifically lists Cain's descendants doing incredibly constructive things.
Right. They go off and build for cities.
Mhm.
They create musical instruments. They become the first metallurgists working with bronze and iron.
The source argues they were blessed, not cursed. Because once you are forgiven and protected by God, that blessing extends to your lineage. They were the architects of early civilization.
So what does this all mean for how we view villains in these ancient stories?
It changes everything.
Yeah, because overturning a lifelong assumption like the evil Cain trope, it makes you realize how much cultural baggage we bring to a text before we even read the first word.
We project so much onto it.
We project our desire for punitive justice onto a story that might actually be about radical grace.
Exactly. It forces us to examine how traditions solidify over time, often obscuring the actual mechanics of the original text. We are looking at how a single textual rereading, shifting the cry of the blood from vengeance to forgiveness, forces a complete rewrite of the entire moral of the story.
It's amazing.
The source demonstrates how elegantly this maps onto their theory, emphasizing the incredible value of multiple perspectives.
Yeah.
When you change one variable in these ancient equations, the entire outcome shifts.
Now, to cement this entire dual prototype theory, the source doesn't just leave it at the broad strokes of blood and marks.
No, they go deep.
They dive into the specific literary motifs woven into both narratives to prove this isn't just some happy accident.
Right.
They argue this is deliberate structural design intended to trigger very specific cognitive associations for the ancient reader.
The density of these woven motifs is just striking.
Yeah.
The ancient authors used recurring imagery like a hyperlink. When an ancient reader saw certain traits grouped together, their brain immediately linked it to other stories with those same traits.
Give us an example.
For instance, the source points out the motif of the shepherd. Abel literally tended sheep, and Jesus is metaphorically known throughout the New Testament as the Good Shepherd.
Right. And then there's the nature of the sacrifices.
Yes.
Both offered acceptable sacrifices to God that were deeply pleasing. Abel brought the firstborn of his flock, and Jesus offered himself.
Then there is the motif of the unblemished lamb,
Mm-hmm.
which is central to ancient Near Eastern sacrificial systems.
Mm-hmm.
Both figures are inextricably linked to lambs. Abel offers one, and Jesus is referred to as the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world.
Wait, if we're really looking at the parallels,
Okay.
what about the motive of the murder?
Oh, that's a big one.
Because Cain killed his own flesh and blood brother out of pure envy.
Right.
And Jesus, in this typological reading, was handed over to the Romans by his own religious and racial brethren out of envy. They were both killed by their own.
That is exactly the kind of structural hyperlink the source is highlighting. The betrayal comes from inside the house, driven by jealousy over divine favor. And both victims approach their end through a specific element of faith.
How so?
Well, Abel sacrifices the lamb in faith, and Jesus sacrifices himself voluntarily out of love. The source specifically quotes Jesus saying, "No one takes my life from me, but I lay it down of my own accord."
And there's a very specific title that links them both in the text, right?
Yes, the title "The Just."
The just.
Both are explicitly labeled with this unique title in Scripture. The source points out that Hebrews chapter 11 calls Abel the just, and in Luke chapter 23, the Roman centurion standing at the cross calls Jesus a just man.
When you lay those motifs out, the shepherd, the acceptable sacrifice, the unblemished lamb, the envious brother, the title of the just, it explains why ancient readers would connect these stories instinctively.
They didn't need a theology degree.
No, they just recognize the pattern of the hyperlinked imagery. It's just wild to think about how these authors wrote character arcs thousands of years apart, yet lock them together with the exact same occupational details and specific titles.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is precisely why exploring ancient texts through different analytical frameworks is so rewarding.
Absolutely.
Whether you are deeply religious, a secular literature enthusiast, or just someone who loves learning how human communication works, this showcases the incredible density of ancient texts.
It really does.
It reveals a profound human drive to weave interconnected cross-generational narratives. These aren't just isolated fables. They are interlocking pieces of a massive, multi-millennial puzzle.
And engaging with sources like Descubriendo la Escritura really prevents that feeling of information overload.
Oh, for sure.
Because when you read a text normally, it can just feel like a barrage of ancient names and bizarre events. But this teaches you how to spot deep structural patterns. You stop memorizing surface-level facts and start seeing the skeleton of the story.
You move from reading a simple list of events to understanding an entire system of meaning.
Right.
Today we move from a tragic story of a jealous brother in a field to a complex, anticipatory blueprint. We explored hidden genealogies acting as negative space, blood crying out for mercy instead of vengeance, and the complete rewriting of the mark of Cain from a curse of evil to a shield of divine grace.
It completely reframes the narrative for you. And it leaves me with this final lingering thought.
What's that?
We talked earlier about Easter eggs in modern movie franchises. Today, our culture is absolutely obsessed with cinematic universes.
We really are.
We love interconnected storytelling, where a small, seemingly insignificant detail in year 1 pays off in an emotional climax in year 10.
Yeah, everybody loves that payoff.
But looking at how these ancient texts were designed with such intricate cross-generational blueprints, it makes you wonder, maybe our modern obsession with cinematic universes isn't a new pop culture invention at all.
Oh, I see where you're going.
Maybe it is just us tapping into a deeply ancient, hardwired human desire to find patterns, meaning, and ultimate destiny in the stories we tell. We just traded ancient scrolls for silver screens.
That is a fascinating connection.
Yeah.
The human desire for a story that means more than just what happens on the surface is clearly thousands of years old.
So the next time you think you know a story from beginning to end, try looking at it in 4 dimensions. You might just find the blueprint hidden underneath.